These girls came to be known as the afflicted children. Their proceedings began at the parsonage about Christmas time, 1691. They would get down on all fours, crawl under chairs and tables, go off into fits, and speak in unintelligible jargon. All this may have been begun in sport. It would doubtless tickle them to find out how well they could imitate Indian medicine, and the temptation to show off their accomplishments would be too great to be resisted. Then, if they found their elders taking the affair too seriously, if they suddenly saw themselves in danger of getting whipped for meddling with such uncanny matters, what could be more natural than for them to seek an avenue of escape by declaring that they were bewitched and could not help doing as they did? As to these first steps, the records leave us in the dark, but somewhat such, I suspect, they must have been. The next thing would be to ask them who bewitched them, and here the road to mischief was thrown open by Mr. Parris taking the affair into his own hands with a great flourish of trumpets, and making it as public as possible. Such was this man's way, as different as possible from Cotton Mather's. Physicians and clergymen who came from all quarters to see the girls agreed that they must be suffering from witchcraft. When commanded to point out their tormentors, they first named the Indian hag Tituba, and then Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, two forlorn old women of the village, who were not held in high esteem. On the last day of February, 1692, these three were arrested, and the examinations began the next day. The chief accusations against Sarah Good were that, after she had spoken angrily to some neighbors, their cattle sickened and died, that she threw Mary Walcott and other children into convulsions, and that she tried to persuade Ann Putnam to sign her name in a book. It was supposed that such signatures were equivalent to a quitclaim deed surrendering the signer's soul to the devil and his agents. The witches were supposed to go about with that infernal autograph book, soliciting signatures. Similar charges were brought against the other prisoners. In their presence, the afflicted children raved and screamed. At the indignant denials of the two old white women, the violence of these paroxysms became frightful. But when Tituba confessed that she was an adept in witchcraft and had enchanted the girls, their symptoms vanished, and perfect calm ensued. As the result of the examination, the three prisoners were sent to the jail in Boston to await their trial. The country was now getting alarmed, and the girls began to feel their power. Their next blow was aimed at victims of far higher sort. The wretched Tituba knew human nature well enough to consult her own safety by acting as king's evidence, and in her examination she testified that 4 women of the village tormented the girls. 2 of them were Good and Osborne, but the faces of the other 2 she said she could not see. After Tituba had gone to prison, the girls were urged to give up the names of these 2 other tormentors. At first they refused, but shortly it began to be whispered in bated breath that some of the most respected and godly persons in the village were leagued with Satan in this horrible conspiracy. About the middle of March, the whole community was thunderstruck by the arrest of Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse. Of these 2 ladies, the former was about 60 years of age, the latter more than 70. As they were addressed not as Mrs., but as Goodwife, their position was not exactly aristocratic. It was nevertheless most respectable. They were thoroughly well-bred and well-educated ladies, full of sweet courtesy and simple-hearted kindliness. like the best of farmers' wives in New England villages of today. Martha Corey was third wife of Giles Corey, a farmer, 80 years old, a man of Herculean stature and strength, proud, self-willed, and contentious, but frank and noble, with a rash and unruly tongue. He had been in many a quarrel and had made enemies. His wife, so far as we know, had not. She was a woman of deep and sincere piety, with as clear and sound a head as could be found anywhere between Cape Cod and Cape Ann. She disbelieved in witchcraft, was inclined to regard it as a mere delusion, and had no sympathy with the excitement which was beginning to turn the village topsy-turvy. She did not flock with the multitude to see the accusing girls, but she reproved her more credulous husband for giving heed to such tomfoolery. And he, with that uncurbed tongue of his, was heard to utter indiscreet jests about his good wife's skepticism. It was probably this that caused her to be selected as a victim. Skeptics must be made to feel the danger of impugning the authority of the accusers, and the truth of their tales. Accordingly, Martha Corey, accused by little Ann Putnam, was soon in jail, awaiting trial. The next was Rebecca Nurse. She was one of 3 sisters, daughter of William Town of Yarmouth in England. Her 2 sisters, who were arrested soon after her, were Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce. With their husbands they were all persons held in the highest esteem, but an ancient village feud had left a grudge against them in some revengeful bosoms. Half a century before, there had been a fierce dispute between parties from Salem and from Topsfield, who had settled in the border region between the 2 townships. The dispute related to the possession of certain lots of land. It had grown more and more complicated, and it had engendered hard feelings between the Putnams on one side and the Easties and Towns on the other. Besides this, Rebecca Nurse and her husband had become obnoxious to the Putnams and to the Reverend Mr. Parris from reasons connected with the church dispute. There was evidently a method to the madness of the accusing girls. Rebecca Nurse was arrested 2 days after the committal of Martha Corey. The appearance of this venerable and venerated lady before the magistrates caused most profound sensation. Her numerous children and grandchildren stood high in public esteem. Her husband was one of the most honored persons in the community, herself a model of every virtue. As she stood there, delicate and fragile in figure, with those honest eyes that looked one full in the face, that soft gray hair, and dainty white muslin kerchief, one marvels what fiend can have possessed those young girls that they did not shamefastly hold their peace. In the intervals of question and answer, they went into fits as usual. When the magistrate Hathorne became visibly affected by the lady's clear and straightforward answers, the relentless Mrs. Putnam broke out with a violence dreadful to behold. "Did you not bring the black man with you? Did you not bid me tempt God and die? How often have you eaten and drunk your own damnation?" At this outburst, like the horrible snarl of a lioness, the poor old lady raised her hands toward heaven and cried, "O Lord, help me!" Whereupon all the affected girls were grievously vexed. Hathorne thought that their spasms were caused by a mysterious influence emanating from Goodwife Nurse's lifted hands, and so his heart was hardened toward her. Mary Walcott cried out that the prisoner was biting her, and then showed marks of teeth upon her wrist. Thus the abominable scene went on till Rebecca Nurse was remanded to jail to await her trial. That was on a Thursday morning. The Reverend Deodat Lawson, a fine scholar and powerful preacher, had arrived in the village a few days before, and it was known that he was to preach the afternoon sermon, familiar in those days as the Thursday lecture. He had scarcely arrived when 2 or 3 of the girls called upon him and drove him nearly out of his wits with their performances. Their victory over him was complete, and the result was seen that in that Thursday lecture, which was afterwards printed and is a literary production of great intensity and power, the arrests of Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse had destroyed all confidence. Everybody distrusted his neighbor, and that impassioned sermon goaded the whole community to madness. If the devil could use such gospel women for his instruments, what safety was there for anybody? Arrests went on with increasing rapidity during the spring and summer until at least 126 persons, of whom we know the names and something of the family history, were lodged in jail. And these names do not exhaust the number. Among them, to mention only such as were executed, we may note that John Proctor and the Venerable George Jacobs had each had one of the accusing girls in his family as a domestic servant, and in both cases personal malice was visibly at work. In the case of George Jacobs, it may also be observed that his own granddaughter, to save her own life, confessed herself a witch and testified against him. Afterwards she confessed this horrible wickedness. Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, and Mary Easty were connected with the Topsfield affair already mentioned. Some, such as Susanna Martin, seem to have owed their fate to mere superstition of the lowest sort. On a rainy day she walked over a good bit of country road without getting her horse or skirts muddy, and it was sagely concluded that such neatness could only have been attained through the aid of the devil. She was mother of the Mabel Martin about whom Whittier wrote his beautiful poem, The Witch's Daughter. John Willard incurred his doom for having said that it was the accusing girls who were the real witches worthy of the gallows, and John Proctor in a similar spirit had said that by the judicious application of a cudgel he could effect a prompt and thorough cure for all the little hussies. People who ventured such remarks took their lives in their hands.